Hello everyone, today we talk about Rome in the Age of Kings and especially her wealthy commercial, material, cultural development, of course reflected mostly through archaeological data. Of course there is a history that is however more like a mythology that we can use of course to connect here and there some political, military and social dynamics but essentially we are limited largely, but also to a great extent, considering the times and places, the archaeological finds. They're quite interesting and indeed matching like the historical idea that we have of the early development of Rome. I think we've never really discussed the Rome of the Age of Kings per se. We talked about feudal Rome that at large does fit this era up to the 4th century, and there would be really a lot to say regarding what we know about all these various this very long period, right? And so also it's various passages in especially political history. But this is why we go step by step, a video at a time, focusing on the topic you can see in the title. Is helpful to substantiate, in fact, what we can draw on the basis of the other lines. And making a history of early Rome is never easy. It's beautiful though, right? And so in this video we'll look mostly at the growing appetite for power among the aristocracy of this nascent power, which in turn fueled commerce, appetite, luxury in really an international sense and range. We will see how Rome presented a very faraway style, such as the ones of Egypt even. There is this orientalizing phase, which mostly Rome acquired from the Etruscan medium. So we're seeing a lot of artistic influence from Greece, from the Levant, and we will analyze it in connection mostly with the aristocracy, because that's also predictably what you would mostly find at this point in a truly feudal society where the oligarchic clans ruled, even in the presence of a monarch. Today we talk, as we will see now, a period that stretches from the end of the 8th to the beginning of the 6th century BC. It's actually a wide time, but that's also what allows us to see things a bit more in perspective and to cover more evidence. Fundamentally, this is the moment in which early Rome traditionally opens to the world, right? And so with this, the world of foreigners as well will also begin to settle in the city. I will again reduce to a minimum any kind of evidential history here, but you know that Rome was not really born as the most important city in Latium. The temple of Jupiter Latiaris at Alba Longa was in many ways like the spiritual, religious soul of the Latins. In this, in fact, quite taking the name after the very land they occupied. We do not actually know how this people was known from the time of the Indo-European migrations, but in fact, being located in a quite peculiar area in the lower Tiber Valley, so very fertile one, enhanced in this by the volcanic ground in which these Italic fortified hilltops were built. And so there is all a very interesting urbanistic history of Rome that today we will not see, but I promise, of course, this is part of a broader series. We will never cease talking about Rome. I mean, I could make the channel entirely about the history, even just of the city of Rome per se, right? I can't think to cover it satisfactorily, even in, 3,000 videos, of course. It's impossible. Any number wouldn't mean anything in comparison. So we see the growth of the city. We see the wealth gathered from feudal warfare being preserved and reinvested, right, with exchanges, transactions. the fueling of the local clienteles, but also in fact of a third estate that is involved in commercial activities. Always remember that Rome is technically born as a frontier area, because imagine like even the contemporary city, well, everything you see on the right bank of the Tiber, where also the ancient city expanded at a point, was Etruria. This was literally land of the Etruscans. The same Sabines arrived up to, very close to what is today, probably the Roman center, from in fact a wider area of Sabina that is essentially a provincial size. And so Rome lays exactly in the center of this area, and it emerges as a market, a series of markets from the villages, from the different communities that, as you know, inhabited the various hills overlooking the river and the surrounding valleys. Everything was much steeper at the time. Of course, it's incredible to think how high certain reliefs were considered. Only that Trajan's column, as you can see it at the fora of Trajan, is as high as the hill that still in early imperial time overlooked the market, right? And it was debanked rightfully. And this is just one of the many examples. It's a completely different Rome, needless to say, that one must make a massive effort to reconstruct even just mentally, visually. Now, these newcomers we were talking about, of course, were mostly from the surroundings, not just much from very far away places, but still, Rome was already that attractive on a very long range. Well, this man produced not only high quality terracotta, but also a variety of bronze and, most importantly, iron objects, which became the predominant material at the time. So, of course, we are transitioning. We've seen it in other videos of the same period. Made lots of videos about 8th, 7th, 6th century BC warfare, especially for the Levant. But that's quite a period of transition from so-called chariot warfare, the Bronze Age, into something, in fact, at least what we associate mostly the Roman with. But remember, there is a lot of chariot warfare. There is a lot of cavalry in early Rome, really incarnated by these oligarchs, these demigods that were meant to be ruling, in fact, over these sacred hills. We find swords, spears, knives, and fibulae, that is, brooches or clasps that replace buttons in clothing. We will see now all more in depth. And in addition to the common goods aimed at a broad segment of the population that was increasing, as we were pointing out, there are also products intended for the small exclusive group of the aristocracy in a more specific way. This includes the best panoply associated with the aforementioned nobiliar warfare, including helmets, shields, two-wheeled carts, horse bits, and metal vessels. Women of rank have their luxury items, such as mirrors and small kistae, that is, as you know, cylindrical containers, typically for jewelry, that are intricately crafted. Right? There is an aspect about early Rome and early Italy, let's say, that is only clear when you put it in perspective with the rest of Europe and the parallel development of Mediterranean civilization. Essentially, that this region, aside from Greece, was essentially the most civilized in Europe from a very early age, and especially would become the one, even before like the full conquest, the full Roman conquest of the same peninsula, that would spread wealth and literacy all over the rest of Europe. Right? There are some interesting, for once, YouTube videos that actually show you, and if you Google, for example, like the spread of literacy in the world, right, and compare this also not just the Mediterranean basin, but India, China, you realize that even though the Romans were that, we insist very much on this very primitive, rough, brutal, warlike, etc., they were in parallel to this, and this is extremely important, already very civilized. right? Of course, one can make the story of the little hut on the Palatine Hill, making sort of a beggar type of history in general, but when you look at this in comparison to world civilizational development, you realize how central Italy was in the general process of especially European civilization, because the Greeks did not expand more than just a bit out of their own niche, whether it's the Hellenic motherland or the colonies. Like, you go 30 kilometers in the hinterland, there is another people that speaks another language that is of different ethnicity, and may even buy Hellenic stuff, as you will see, by the way, in the case of Rome now, at this point. But that, remember, we talked also about the Argus panoply, some interesting influence from Archean warfare. So this is already a fairly late time, like, in the history of, say, if you put it in perspective, especially the passage between Bronze and Iron Age warfare, not meant strictly on the basis of the respective metals, but literally in a way to the world, let's say. But back to Rome, as an introduction for the rest of the continent, we will see now jewelry makers competing with one another, enhancing also female vanity by creating exquisite and delicate items, including the first silver and amber hairpins, right? For example, fashioned in filigree, the extremely sophisticated stuff, remember, for the time being. So what had been pastoral Rome, at least in almost a bucolic ideal, of course, was aggressively and quickly transforming into a very important hub of exchange between, especially, the Etruscan, we said it, but also from the sea, considering that that Etruria and her outposts were the meaning of this, the Hellenic world. We have to talk more about the Etruscans, because now did it too much on Schwer. So what is fascinating here is that both the Etruscans and the Greeks were actually eager to expand already at this point their markets to the Romans specifically, that were thus already, even in this mist of strictly defined history for our, say, political or eventual understanding, actually recognizing these people very neatly, right? And because, of course, the latter were beginning to savor the sweet pleasures of luxury, so to say. That's a motive in Roman history. We made an entire video about the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, about how still the mid-2nd century BC Romans were struggling, like between, let's say, luxuria and gravitas, let's say. And so don't presume that, of course, the Romans were that easily consumed by wealth from a moral point of view, because here they are yet to take off as the God-chosen people, at least in the actual conquest of the world. But again, let's remember, they were not only primitives, even though they were primitives in a positive sense. Now, archaeologically wise, to get a bit more technical, the shift in production methods that began in Latium during the so-called M phase solidified during the RV phase, that is commonly referred to as the so-called Orientalizing period, because again, all the greater civilizational development at this point was concentrated in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Italy, as we've seen, was the most receptive country in the West to absorb its fruits. The primary indicator of this archaeological change, of course, is found in tombs, both in their structural aspects and, most importantly, in their grave goods. Naturally, they were bigger, more expensive tombs, but it's especially the corredum that starts impressing about the the local elite's power. The archaeological documentation from Latium is particularly significant compared to other parts of central Italy. Indeed, except from Etruria herself, like there aren't so many prosperous areas in the Apennine heartland, especially. And we base ourselves for this period on the very important discoveries made in the 19th century at Palestrina and Satricum, along with numerous excavations as well as in Decima and Laurentina. This encompasses a broad area, so that's not only Rome, right, in its urban confines. It's the Latium Vetus. Some areas actually inhabited by the Etruscans, others by Oscan peoples like the Volsci, and so there is plenty of interesting history to browse about these peoples, for their own individual history in other videos. We see how, of course, everything was connected through the roads that connected these centers to Rome. Everything at this point is, again, very, say, not anarchic, but again, Rome has, first of all, yet to emerge as the dominant force in Latium, and the broader political connections are still pretty loose, right? There is a sense that the Latins are different people within the Latium Faliscans, right, from compared to the Oscans in the Italic branch of the Indo-European peoples, and a great part of this difference is, of course, also geographical in nature. I mean, the Latins emerge from this side of the Apennine on the Tyrrhenian Sea. They're more exposed to the Etruscans, for sure, but there are lots of infiltrations, in fact, from the Apenninic interland, especially the pastoral Rome owed much to also transhumance of Italic tribesmen from the mountains to the plains in seasonal alternation, and it's mostly war, a lot of it, that was predictably molding them into something more cohesive. All these centers, as we observed, were essentially fortified hilltops. They were already displaying, as we'll see now, this important level of, if you want, urbanization, proto-urbanization. In the Latins, the Italics were lagging relatively behind compared to the Etruscans, definitely to the Greeks in this, but they are also pretty bulky settlements with pretty active and bellicose communities. There are interesting finds that occur every once in a while. For example, the princely tomb near Rocca di Papa, close to Rome. We don't have to talk much about the geography here, but consider that Rome is also sheltered by mountains, especially in the south and in the east, right? And these centers are originally also very, powerful because literally of their greater height. Rocca di Papa simply means papal rock, right? And there is all, of course, a nomenclature that derives from before even the Roman conquest that we can trace. At a point, we can make a video on the etymologies, the linguistics behind, of course, the Latin names at the time. Now, most known tombs for today's topic belong to the early and the middle Orientalizing phases. That is 4A, so-called, dating from around 720 to 640 BC. While a smaller number belong to the late Orientalizing phase, 4b from around 640 to 590, 580 BC. This could actually, as interestingly, point out at a greater princely, if not monarchic, bias existing, in fact, in this early phase of Roman history, even though that's a complicated story and sort of a debatable observation. The graves are altogether, when we evaluate them for this broader period, predominantly pit style, right? But larger than the previous period, that the so-called like pastoral one of probably the foundation of Rome, and they are more complex, right? The foundation of Rome, at least according to the Baronian date, often rectangular in shape. Grave goods are no longer concentrated at the head or feet of the deceased. They are instead arranged along one side, usually the right, and sometimes placed in loculi carved into the side walls. So it's becoming something more of a palace, right? A residence for the afterlife. If you're interested in the traditional view of afterlife these peoples believed in, you can check out the couple of videos I made on the traditional meaning of death, right? Of properly survival, with the hopeful survival of the soul in the second death. Everything would be clearer there. So there is definitely a great expansion here. The elites are actually increasing in power and establishing something more princely in nature, due to their, as we've seen, activities, their authority, their hierarchical role, especially in clashing against the various neighbors. Personal items, particularly valuable ornaments and weapons, are always positioned with the deceased, which is also a very important mark of outer power. This would have been habitually used also in life, right? Ritual practices often involve the intentional breaking and scattering of one or more pots during the burial, possibly as part of a specific ritual. In contrast to the standard pit graves, there are also examples of stone sarcophagi, like the one found in Vivaro, which measures 1.5 by 3.8 meters. Some graves even feature a pseudo-chamber structure sealed with a stone cover supported by wooden beams and sometimes true pillars of tuff, right? Volcanic stone, so abundant in the region. These again develop the sense of an aristocratic mention, right, and of a palatine sacrality. In the middle orientalizing phase, graves can have such large pits or boxes that they resemble pseudo-chambers where the deceased is laid on an actual bed or a low platform surrounded by shield displays and possibly vessels. Details about the princely tombs at Palestrina indicate that the largest one, known as the Bernardini tomb, this is after people who owned the place, who discovered it, who studied, etc., was lined with tough orthostats and featured a ceiling of limestone and travertine slabs, ever more seigneurial. The deceased likely lay inhumed within a paved loculus, suggesting a unique tradition in Latium influenced by similar practices observed in contemporaneous Etruscan tombs. If you're interested in the later, say, Apollonian revival, the sense of importance of incineration also for Roman emperors against what had been like the Etruscan Telluric lunar influence of the surrounding peoples, the reactivation of more Apollonian Indo-European system of values, you can check the video about the superiority of Roman civilization. The relation between the Romans and Etruscans is always very, very important to stress in that dichotomic sense, because it's really how the Romans had interiorized that in their mythology, in the mists of their history. You can definitely even interpret this Pelasgian influences coming from places as far as Egypt and Phoenicia, being like that pernicious, creeping of sort of the anti-tradition that Rome would eventually overthrow, fighting, against Carthage, conquering Egypt. And this is literally what the Romans would eventually come to believe. And always remember, here we're talking about the elites, so the single most open, say, far-ranging in terms of power and ambition individuals in the system that would have actually upheld some of the most archaic and traditional values, but still using everything that they had at their disposal, including the manifestation of powers that this material culture could provide them with. Then in other videos we shall go a bit behind that, thinking what actually Rome could be. Again, made lots of at least military points about this in the Roman feudal warfare period. Now, overall, the developments in tomb construction and burial practices reflect a significant evolution in societal complexity, needless to say, as well as cultural interactions, as we're just pointing out during this period. In the princely cremation tombs, and we see that more markedly Indo-European practices, even at least surviving at this point, of Ponte Cagnano, particularly the tombs 926 and 928, there is a notable depiction of the loculus symbolizing the Homeric thalamus, right, where the household treasures are stored. Indeed, also, the Etruscans were very much into Homeric epics. Everybody was pretty much obsessed with this, with Achilles. It was a pretty universal tale, to say at least, not properly religious belief. And here the beauty also of later Etruscan thalamoi, for example, that are very famous, is originating with that having essentially a funerary banquet, right, and then over these beds de facto, and the Romans, the Latins in this case, adopted as well. The true chamber tombs, equipped with entrance doors, appeared early on in Satricum and Rome herself. At Satricum, the above-ground chambers covered by earthen mounds exhibit a variety of shapes. Some are curvilinear or square with central posts or walls made of alternating tuff blocks and vertical voids. In Rome, chamber structures were constructed with projecting squared blocks or entirely carved into rock, including a tomb that dates to the early phase 4b, showcasing a rich array of Proto-Corinthian pottery. Notably, this tomb holds a transitional style old inscribed in Corinthian script, linked to the vase's owner. It's even possible that Romans would seek for some sort of less chthonic and more immortalizing burial sites, such as, in fact, a mansion carved into the rock as opposed to be covered in earth. In fact, again, Rome does maintain always this more recognizably Apollonian dimension. Now, a little later, the only recorded chamber tomb from Osteria dell'Osa, which features two chambers accessible via a sloped dromos, reflects its elite nature through the presence of 11 interments disregarding prior burials. Similar practices of overcrowding graves were observed at Torino and in the Sasso Bianco necropolis. Regarding burial site organization, the tombs tended to cluster in groups, indicative of Gentile affiliation rather than mere familial ties. We're talking about those oligarchic military clans ruling over the lower Tiber Valley and pretty much also elsewhere, but significantly more powerful here. Particularly interesting is the Laurentina side, characterized by hierarchically structured groups, where smaller tombs cluster around more significant ones. The composition of grave goods further illustrates the aristocratic behavior during the Orientalizing periods wherein displays of wealth were used to reinforce status privileges. Exceptional princely tombs found in ancient Palestrina, such as the Galeassi, Castellani, the aforementioned Bernardini and Barberini tombs, stand out for their opulence, surpassing even Etruscan standards. This is really interesting. These tombs generally contain a single deposition featuring a wealth of precious materials like gold, silver, ivory, amber, glass, and maiolica, echoing the splendor of the Levantine royal courts. So essentially these Latins were attributing, even though they were actually a much less stratified society than the Etruscan one, it was sort of much closer, in fact, to the Near Eastern, autocratic rules, even though, again, very diluted, and just by comparison, not because they had actually much to do with them. They were mostly elites imitating one another across the Mediterranean, attributed more power to these clan leaders, to the point of a sacral aura. Indeed, the Etruscans had the Lucumons, for example, that were, royal, that were essentially city-states kings and priests at the same time. Here, of course, we're in very early times, so the Latins would have tried to maintain both powers, of course, and the same kings of Rome showed us, but we see these tombs evidently not being, the ones of Roman kings specifically, but scattered all around. There is, in the video recently made about Pyrrhus, of course, much later, like half of a millennium almost after this, that anecdotally said, at least was told by Cuneus, how that had visited the Roman Senate still in that relatively archaic time, and that it seemed to him that this was a consensus of kings, fundamentally. The patricians, the clan leaders, had maintained that much of a sense of themselves and authority and charisma to be, in fact, joining this hyper-sacred and ultimately, in fact, divine evangelion that Rome was. But going back to our archaic times, the two richest tombs of the four we mentioned, that is, the Bernardini and Barberini ones, contained deceased individuals adorned with gold dragon brooches, gold fasteners of various types, and massive rectangular gold breastplates secured with silver pins. Right, this is definitely the burial of a king. Right, remember the role that gold has, of course, in the European mythology. And so the necessity, still in this age of gods rather than heroes, that this power manifestation had. Now, these breastplates featured intricate Etrusco-Oriental decorations, including around 130 tiny animal figurines crafted using a stamping technique and adorned with granulation. This suggests a unique Latin fashion element, possibly a ceremonial version of an 8th century cardiophylax transformed by Etruscan goldsmiths into a lavish bestiary. The cardiophylax is essentially a chest plate, armor, right? Like the later hastati, like conceptually at this point we're talking about, in fact, something extremely more expensive, if anything, also in relative terms to the respective societies. That would be like after the helmet, like the most important part of these warriors' armament. We will talk about this early Latin warriors as well. Now, the Bernardini tomb also housed personal weapons, including an entirely silver sword with an amber-coated hilt and 2 iron swords with silver sheaths and ivory hilts. Top luxury products for an incredibly powerful elite. Bronze shields, commonly found in both male and female tombs, as well as a 2-wheeled chariot, were symbolic items of status rather than purely military gear. Nevertheless, it is extremely clear what the role of these individuals was in their societies. And again, remember chariot warfare, that as we have observed also outside of Mesopotamia or any flat land, of course was used, right? Pretty much everywhere. It doesn't matter whether the Italian hinterland is pretty hilly and rugged. We know, of course, that chariot warfare had spread from Central Asia to everywhere, and still it was a thing among these. Also, still, however, infantry-based forces at large. Of course, there was a lot of mounted cavalry by the side of the same aristocrats, but the chariot still was a thing. It would still be a thing in Roman iconography later on. We do find, I don't know, I think it was found in Croatia recently, from the early imperial era, some local aristocrat actually being buried with a chariot, meaning literally a war chariot in concept, because the one bringing the hero to battle, guided by the eagle, that is the Holy Ghost, etc. That is the entire universal iconography of the world at the time. But in these times, they still used, of course, the chariot in combat, and especially in this sort of more primitive cultures. The silver tableware from the Bernardini tomb included a complete set for banquets, featuring a covered lebed, 5 intricately engraved globular cups, 4 cotuli, a Cypriot jug, 2 plates, and a grater. We have explained in the aforementioned videos about the traditional meaning of afterlife how, of course, there was a manic dimension of some of the totem that lived in the underworld in those souls, in those remains that had not partaken in the process of divine transfiguration to earn a point in the firmament, that these peoples thought they had to continuously fuel, nourishing, hence tradition that still exists in some parts of Europe of giving food to the dead, bringing food on tombs. I can think of Serbia mostly, but there are many others. Say, still also in more advanced realities, the idea of banqueting at a funeral is an actual thing, and it does derive from that, as a matter of fact. So you see also this interest for banquets, funerary banquets, were a recurring theme in this Roman Italic culture. We see here a Cypriot jug, so showing how these elites could afford such very expensive items to, on top, add the price of transportation for such faraway places. Notably, a super gold cotyle with decorative handles and a blue glass cup imported from Syria, likely a prototype for similar silver ones, were among the distinguished items. We talked about Assyrian warfare during this period multiple times, and also how much military grandeur came with the idea of these peoples. These were those also well lined up infantry lines were developing to the sophisticated extent of tactical order. We are in the same centuries here of the Argus panoply. So remember that video I made on how, of course, nor the Romans nor the Etruscans ever had any trace of hoplitic warfare, but still, in fact, you don't need to be a hoplite or fighting a hoplitic battle, whatever that is, in order to fight with that kind of order, starting to appear at some point in this archaic era, also in the Latin armies, etc. It's very gradually, etc. But again, look at the videos made on Roman archaic warfare. But speaking still of faraway places, we see in the same tomb the intricately decorated silver vessels, predominantly featuring an Egyptian influence style, but originated either from Phoenicia or Cyprus. Bronze vessels, essential for banquets, showcased a bold northern Syrian style, including a double-walled cups and a monumental truncated conical support for a wine cauldron embellished with siren and griffin motifs. Etrusco-Oriental style furniture and vessels, such as a tripod with figurines and a curved back throne from the Barberini tomb, further adorned the banquet setup. The ivory pieces, mostly poorly preserved, included pithoi, made from tusk sections and decorative chest coverings. These artifacts illustrate a rich cultural exchange and craftsmanship, essentially in Etruria, right? Particularly in Cairo, today's Cerveteri, with influence from Eastern artisans. Easterners broadly meant, right? The princely burials of Latium represent a crucial chapter in the history of Italian Orientalizing art, featuring early uses of writing influenced Hellenic Euboean models. The contested inscriptions from the Bernardini tomb reflect ongoing debates regarding the Etruscanness of Vetusia and the authenticity of associated artifacts, so highlighting the complexity of this historical narrative. We do not know exactly where made them, from which influence, whether these were, say, foreign artisans, or they had, artisans had learned from the craft from who knows whom at that point. Villa Uffa on the Quirinal Hill highlights the strong attraction of the Latium area to external culture, for sure, evidenced by the inscriptions there from an Hellenic individual from the Esquiline Hill, and Etruscans from the Santo Mabono area, and the sanctuary of Satricum. Satricum in the southeast of Rome. And these are, as we were saying before, like they were Etruscans in the same what the city of Rome is today, because again the right bank of the river was Etruria, right? Now the concentration, and then there you would have all the markets like the greater exchange post, right? Also craftsmen that would settle there in order to just be closer to the logistical connections, like hubs, and profiting more from that. These people would become Roman at the point. Their descendants, at least. The concentration of high-level Orientalizing tombs in Palestrina, as in the east of Rome, on the Albanian hills, raises issues, especially when compared to regions like Caire, Vetulonia, or Ponte Cagnan. Palestrina's lesser tombs contrast with other sites like Marsiliana and various centers in the Valdarno region. So we're talking probably like the heartland of Etruscan civilization in the north, essentially in the north of Tuscany. The Valdarno we know well because of Florence and Pisa, but made some videos about those already, highlighting how these centers of development would be much later from now, be absorbed by Rome. Because this is the area also where aristocratic phenomena emerge. Remember that Etruscan society is extremely hierarchical in nature. There is a bunch of overwhelmingly rich people, and basically all the rest of the population that, yes, originally counted sort of lower estates, also segmented forces that could take up arms, etc., but that on the longer run become just serfs of some sort, working in the massive estates of the elites. Umbria is a bit like that, even though those were Italic, they were heavily influenced by the Etruscans. The Latins are different. The Latins maintained that sort of, again, tribal, primitive Indo-European substratum, whereby wealth is more evenly distributed. That's also what you see in, say, in the relative uniformity of the Roman legion, the participation, also the plebs at some point was recognized as Roman citizenry. Here we are in very early times. Nobody was really thinking about that, but you can already see the differences between the two populations. Now, the aforementioned locations, perceived as peripheral, indicate a socioeconomic basis founded on the control of trade routes and cattle ranching rather than agriculture, meaning that some fringes, of course, like Palestrina, compared to what was really like the grandeur of Etruscan civilization at that point, were much more Latin in that profile, and so they were much more brutal, much more also directly warlike, and so cattle, not just ranching, but also raiding, the activities coming from that, and the predatory Italic backbone attitude of, say, like, let's descend from the hinterland, from the mountains, and let's occupy the more florid centers of the coastland, were monopolized already by Etruscans or the Greeks, that led to that kind of more humble, but also on the longer run more successful lifestyle. Tom's findings reveal a society that resembles traditional chiefdoms rather than newly emerging estates from urban centers. All right, so this makes a lot of sense, because even though, as we were saying before, these areas compared to the rest of the world are particularly developed, of course they do not have quite developed that idea of city, right? The concept of city-state is mostly like even here coming from the Levant. As you know, not even the Greeks at this point have really fully developed the concept of polis. It was mostly, the idea of a hilltop ruled by aristocrats with a sacred citadel ruling over the lower estates living at its bases. In Latium, it's something similar, right? Except it's a more, again, tribal and warlike context compared to Greece, that is also richer, and so we understand that chiefdoms were sort of much more reliant on war bands, on mobility, and almost semi-nomadic style than the one of a fixed point, so that even Rome, it's the difference between the comitatus and the zippa that we have already seen in European history. There is like a degree of nobility and sacrality connected with, of course, the military activity and mobility in this sense, this itinerant, nightly, errant style kind of lifestyle, and then the lesser estates more tied to agriculture that support actually these demigods that fight here and there. And the same in Rome would be a conglomeration, again, of these leaders, of these war banders, and that's where you can imagine like the origin of the patricians, as we were pointing out before. Noteworthy are the rich princely tombs that signify funeral wealth, common also in less grandiose tombs from Satricum and Decima. Exotic items frequently appear in medium wealth graves, such as a bronze cup from Satricum and several Phoenician pottery pieces from Decima, or Decima if you want the classical pronunciation. This is fascinating because it makes you wonder on like how many of these warriors would have actually served abroad, where another. I mean, when we think about the sea peoples back in the day, or we do know that there was a big deal of Europeans coming to the Levant as warbender, and this is like, of course, like we don't have any deeper, say, explicit evidence, but say actually this is pretty deep already by itself. You have these items that, of course, were traded at large in the Mediterranean, but could have simply been raided. Maybe not as far as Phoenicia, but we're pretty certain about the fact that if there were Italic mercenaries and, I don't know, Carthaginian Hellenistic armies, and we found even an Italic military settler in the Ptolemaic army proper. Like in the early days, there was surely some Latin warrior roaming the Nile Valley, looting stuff and managing to bring it back to Italy. And this is extremely interesting. When you think about the DNA, when you think about this idea of the Trojans, of course, by that point it was a matter of canon, rather also by Virgilian times, and because there were also multiple legends before about it. But the connection with the Levant, of course, was there, right? Surely there were some Latin or Italic warriors fighting for the Hittites, right? Again, it is possible and certain, even, as we can understand also this deep connection with it's not just a matter of economical status, but also a military one, indeed, as we've seen in this military tombs. Some of these tombs also contain ancient imports that depict the Hellenic practice of using oil and wine. In terms of personal adornments, a gold and amber female pectoral from the tomb Galkasse closely resembles another found in Decima, which also contained horse equipment. Recent excavations uncovered elaborate garments worn by women of the upper Middle Estates, characterized by silver laminated fabrics adorned with multicolored beads and amber. This is interesting because it shows how relatively generalized, of course, the military connection was for a large part of the Latin population. You even find women with these horse equipment in their tombs, so it's quite fascinating. These outfits show, of course, Eastern influences while still retaining, however, local elements, such as bronze brooches that have historical precedence in earlier burial practices. Middle-level tombs from the ancient to middle Orientalizing periods provide valuable insights into the lifestyle, housing, and dietary practices of the aristocratic estates. You can imagine this being very much the case in Rome. Among the bronze artifacts found are items for women's grooming, such as toiletry, cistas, fans, and footstools, as well as incense burners. Noteworthy pottery includes large stands supporting vessels that mimic metal forms and decorative braziers. Excavations at settlements complement these findings, revealing domestic utensils from 2 huts in Satricum, which included clay vessels and a Proto-Corinthian wine service. The lifestyle of these inhabitants indicated a high standard of living. For the mature Orientalizing period, significant evidence comes from Ficana, where the remains of what is possibly the oldest house in Latium were discovered. This house featured a transverse layout with multiple rooms and an open courtyard. Approximately 75 square meters inside, it had painted clay walls and a tiled roof. Within the courtyard, a complete set of banquet ceramics was found, including large cooking vessels, various dishes, and decorated cups, suggesting it could accommodate over 30 diners. Italian lifestyle, really. And that this finding aligns well with the funeral offerings, highlighting the reflection of domestic furnishings in burial goods. The architecture of Ficana signifies a structural transformation from simple huts to more complex homes within a few decades, marked by the introduction of heavier roofing materials and sturdier foundations. These newer houses often followed rectangular plans with significant spaces, while some displayed unusual shapes. evidence of continuity in habitation is seen in the overlapping construction of the newer houses over older huts. Ficana also revealed more intricate buildings similar to those in Roman Satricum, where huts were gradually replaced by more permanent structures. This signifies, in fact, a success of the polities that were witnessing such level of proto-urbanization in parallel to these housing. The discovery of unblended leveling layers suggests that the beginning of the so-called Phase 4b dates back to around 630 BC. The oldest building from this period is superimposed over a large cult hut, and perfectly fits within the perimeter of this first, so to say, temple dedicated to the Mater Matuta, the Aurora. Dumézil wrote beautiful pages on Camillus' cult revolving around her and his devotion during the siege of Veii, and there are lots of implications there. The sort of more chthonic plebeian element was now being compelled, but voluntarily, so into the army. We'll talk about the genesis of the Manipular Legion some other time, but it's how ancient these Mediterranean matters were in the moment in which they had already been subjugated by the Indo-European fathers, right, in all of this. We'll talk more about, for example, the Capitoline Triad, etc. Now, the aforementioned temple has a rectangular plan measuring 6 by 10.4 meters, with a base constructed from small cut blocks arranged in at least 2 rows, plus an additional foundational layer. This is how big temples were at the time in this Latin context. And again, but they were already very important in relative terms in this size. Now, similar plan and slightly smaller dimensions can be found in the eastern sanctuary of Gabii, which is thought to be more recent even. A smaller yet similarly designed temple dedicated to Jupiter Feretrus is located on the Capitoline Hill itself and is considered the oldest Roman temple founded by Romulus and rebuilt by Ancus Marcius. At Satricum, buildings A and B were constructed with a similar orientation as the shrine, featuring larger tough blocks for the base. The better preserved building, A, likely had a portico and comprised 2 wings with 4 rooms of varying sizes surrounding a courtyard that contained a well. The structure formed a quadrangle measuring 24.2 by 25 meters, comparable to palaces in Aquarossa, Etruria, and the final layout of the Rhegion in Rome, which had a portico wing with 3 rooms. The area also likely housed the shrines of Mars and Ops mentioned in literary sources. However, the plan of the Curia Hostilia occupying the main site of the Comitium remains unknown, with only some roof tiles surviving after a fire. Architecturally, there is a contrast between these advanced designs and the modest decoration, especially of roofs, unlike the revealed structures in inner Etruria, such as Aquarossa and Murlo. A house in Ficana might have only had basic architectural decorations. Definitely Latium was more primitive, Spartan than Etruria at the time. The building A in Satricum had a roof tile with an acroterion featuring 2 opposing volutes and an uncertain male head, possibly dating to the early 6th century. The shrine seemingly lacked decorated terracotta elements, while the Regia was equipped from its face with gutter tiles fastened with nails and marked for assembly, but with minimal decoration. That, again, Latin rigidity we're talking about in the videos about the Romano-Italic Indo-European identity is coming handy here. Now, significant urban planning innovations accompanied these developments. In Rome, the construction of early houses followed the laying of substantial gravel and pebble layers in the central forum around the mid-7th century, which were more robust than two layers laid afterward during the late 7th or early 6th centuries. Concurrently, the area later occupied by the Regia was flattened and marked with a stone. The Comitium area was similarly paved around 620 BC, coinciding with the construction of the first Curia and Regia. So Rome is ennobling herself with this stone building infrastructure. This comprehensive building program likely involved the definitive water management of the Forum Valley, which was, as you know, very marshy in the early days. Remember, staying on hilltops also because of the lower marshes and malaria, things like that. And this drainage, this reclamation is traditionally attributed to Tarquinius Priscus. So this myth or history comes handy in at least pointing out that in the Roman memory there had been properly the record of that specific work so early in time. This entire program is viewed as the clearest indicator of Rome's urban transformation, often connected in historical accounts with the first Etruscan king, so we should be sometime, of course, according to the chronology, 616, 579 BC. Right, this is a moment in which Rome, thanks to kings and their patrician followers, managed to compact in a proper urbs. Archaeological evidence, however, suggests that the initial transformations might have been furthered by Ancus Marcius earlier than this, 640-616 BC according to the traditional chronology. Ancus Marcius was known, in fact, for major projects such as the wooden bridge over the Tiber River, which was that important because of the aforementioned traffic between Latium and Etruria. So you want to favor that exchange, not just through boats, but also like a safer passage on the other bank. Now, the urban transformation phenomenon in Latium is characterized by the construction of new and extensive fortifications alongside the development of housing, which is obvious considering what we were pointing out before, the essentially military as oligarchic development of these communities. Examples include the significant earthworks at Satricum, which encircle a burial mound containing a rich tomb dating back to the early 4B phase, and the massive earthworks at Ardea, where one site at Civitavecchia required extensive labor for excavation. Similarly, an ancient wall surrounding the urban area of Lavinium was built using large stones and smaller fill. The organized terraced settlement on Monte Carbolino overlooking the Pontine Plain represents an early example of urban planning featuring monumental stone walls and rudimentary gates. Remember the general function of these settlements: storing wealth, defending it, predatory capacities. Remember that there are marshes all around. The Pontine Plain was drained by the Romans first, and only in the age of fascism, later on after the empire. Just think how powerful nature actually is. And settlements like these are also on the sea that, remember, is trafficked. Right, there are Etruscan and Hellenic ships going back and forth, and the reason, so let's say these Halic were sort of more of a terrestrial force, but they surely had their own piracy, and so there is a lot of, again, cattle raiding, infesting each other's territory. Again, these this wealth we're documenting serves largely to reinforce these communities' capacities to wage war in more articulated fashion. During the latter half of the 7th century, there was a notable decline in funerary consumption, with fewer elaborate graves and less valuable grave goods, indicating a shift, if anything, in aristocratic behaviors. We know that this was still a very heavily feudal reality. The elite seemingly began to adopt self-regulation rather than compete for opulence, focusing instead on public displays of religious devotion, as evidenced by increasingly rich votive deposits and early temple constructions. This is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. So from the first, artistic archaeological comparison, a comparative one, this reflects a departure from Etruscan influences, occurring, and this is the most important part, ironically, or actually very seriously, during the rise of the Tarquin dynasty from Etruria, which was apparently Hellenic in origin. So this means two things. First of all, the idea of some local monarch as such is actually reinforcing to an extent, but is evidently meeting already with some resistance that, as you know, later on would bring to the same end of the Tarquinians, and that will, in fact, bring on for simply the Latin patriciate as such, that evidently is also strengthening a general sense of let's say, deference, of loyalty to something that was not just the leader per se, but now the deification of Rome, right? And so a power that was gradually elevating itself. This is true, as we've seen, also for Latium broadly meant, and this could extend, in fact, to an important degree to the increasing compacting and homogenizing capacities of leagues, of centers, to contrast this ever greater powers that are forming, and that is also disciplining, regulating, through sumptuary laws, essentially the display of power, right, in a non-anarchic way. Because we've seen that the centers we were provided with some extremely expensive items are yes, they were important even at this time for this reason, because of the local rulers, but they're not, say, overarching Latin powers like over the entire area. Like, they are very local, right? So now there is something more disciplined, if you want, something that is compacting the ranks of the same patriciate. Additionally, during the Orientalizing period, viticulture was apparently introduced to Latium. This is often attributed to Numa, to the king Numa, with evidence of grape remaining in tombs dating to around the 8th century. All right. The cultivation of olives appears later, documented starting from the age of Servius Tullius, but earlier signs suggest local production in the 4B phase. Viticulture and olive farming significantly transformed the agricultural landscape of Latium, so signifying the more rationalizing direction that, again, the elite was taking in the exploitation of the territory, and the general, say, sacks of stability that the massive estates of these leaders could provide with these specialized crops. Production in this context is rooted in private land ownership, of course, and the enclosure of properties as well. So there is always a lot of war. This is not ended. This is very reminiscent, really, of even medieval feudal Europe, truly, like the idea that feudalism booms, like also agriculture booms, when the encapsulation period happens. All right, this is not a coincidence, including the long-range, in fact, exchanges. This enclosure of properties can be traced back to the legislation of Numa, according to tradition, Historiography has naturally very much analyzed artisanal production, particularly in relation to burial goods. The production of pottery is largely in the hands of specialists, and the use of the fast wheel is becoming widespread, leading to increasing standardization of shapes. A significant development is the introduction of red slip pottery, which was previously seen in funerary contexts, and is now associated with various new forms, possibly influenced by Phoenician designs via Pithegus. So we were talking the Campania in that case, and so again, maritime trade. These forms are linked to Pithegus, by the way, is near to Puteolum Baia, those very famous florid places that would be also host the Roman navy later, just the Tyrrhenian one. Now these forms are linked to emerging dining practices centered around banquets and wine consumption, including dishes, bowls, jars, mixing vessels, and more. Based on distribution, it can be inferred that vessels with animal protomes and rarely decorated vases with white painting or red were likely produced in Rome, while crater cups seem to be a distinctive product of Decima. In the Orientalizing Middle and Late periods, there is a rich production of red pottery jars with ribbing and stamps. Conversely, brown pottery, which flourished in earlier periods, is seeing rich Orientalizing engravings inspired by Faliscan styles. And the Faliscans were, as we were saying before, a people belonging, in fact, to the Latino-Faliscan branch of the Italic peoples on the Mediterranean side, except the Faliscans lived in the Apennine hinterland, yes, always on the Tyrrhenian side of the watershed, up river, Tiber, closer to the Etruscans, and being sort of detached, and apparently being like another. It's been even hypothesized, even though there is no way of really confirming this, that this branch of the Italic peoples may have migrated more straightly from the north, so like central, say, properly north of the Alps, whereas the Oscans would have come in an important part, not just from the, say, more or less today's Austria, Hungary, through the Adriatic, in fact, spreading mostly through the Adriatic coastal area, but also the hinterland, and or from the Balkans themselves. Consider also the Illyrians among the Italian peoples, right, and the Italic ones. So we'll talk about these things in other videos, but I already discussed this a bit in, again, that video about the Indo-European identity of the Germano-Italic people. And there is also a proliferation of new shapes related to banqueting, by the way. The ritual vessels include elegantly decorated small amphorae, while ceremonial significance appears in peculiar ascoi with pseudo-spiral designs. Ornamental styles help identify active workshops in Rome and Satricum, with potential exports to Etruria. This tells you how much of a third estate existed in Rome already at this point, under the edges of the patricians and the monarchy. Now, the consistent yet monotonous output of painted pottery, which transitioned from linear, subgeometric to Corinthian-like styles, as well as Buccher ceramics, is also notable, with some production evidently occurring in Latium. Additionally, while space is lacking for a thorough discussion, of course, of the flourishing production of bronze work, goldsmithing, and wood, amber and ivory carving, we've seen them being prominent at this period, some of the most magnificent tombs, it is evident that all organized crafts under the Collegia Opificum, so the Roman artisan guilds, right, dating back to Numa. These were the mob of the artisans, of the skilled workers this time, are well documented in Rome and in Latium around 700 BC. A unique indication of gold consumption is provided by a dental prosthesis found in tomb 18 at Satricum, dating to the early phase 4B, which was an old art, with the medical one, especially like prostheses, etc. Was especially orthopedy was always historically very advanced. It was one of the most obviously developed branches in medicine since the ancient times. But it also shows really the level of societal complexity that already Rome witnessed in this very archaic times, to say the least. It's difficult while looking at such relative refinements or sort of connections with our modern world to imagine how truly distant, like for our belief system, these people actually were, at least how much we fell short of that same belief system, which we still somehow are, but with minimal, with very feeble vitality. And so this is something better explained in other videos about warfare, etc. But never forget that we have Rome, right? This is something extremely important in the history of mankind, but especially in the history of the West. I'm preparing some videos explaining more thoroughly what it truly means to have Rome in a broader sense, because people do not seem to have an actual grasp of the cosmic centrality that Rome has in the sole possible meaning of mankind and of God. Like, there is no God outside of Rome, like there's never been historically, or even mythologically. The point is, of course, recovering this basis. Today we looked at somehow archaeology, so it's pleasant every once in a while to digress on these topics, but always remember how much there is, how much we have, how much you simply can walk in, right? This other year the next year we have the Jubilee, for example, as a massive Catholic celebration and event, to say the least. But in this sense, consider, where did that come from, right? Why is it that we are talking Rome, and why it's such a central deal? Like, we have been completely habituated to consider the traditional reason, the traditional values of this, and that's unfortunate. Nevertheless, there is always time for remedy. That's why also there is a Schwerpunkt, as long as I can go on, of course. And again, I'm preparing something that should wake us a little bit up regarding the traditional meaning of Rome, really. I think, however, this will be, of course, for another time. For today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.